So Dunbar's number is the natural limit on the number of relationships, meaningful relationships, that you can have at any one time.
Robin Dunbar is a renowned British anthropologist and evolutionary psychologist whose pioneering research has reshaped our understanding of human social networks.
Stick with 150. 100 isn't any good. Everything will fall apart. 200 isn't any good either. Everything will fall apart.
Best known for Dunbar's number, he reveals how our brain has limits on the number of meaningful relationships we can sustain.
It is literally a cognitive limit, that we don't have the sort of brain power capacity to manage more than 3 other minds in a conversation.
Robin unpacks the evolution of our social bonds and challenges us to rethink how we can connect in an ever-changing world.
And the problem with all friendships, of both men and women, is that if you don't invest in them, they decay.
All this and more on the Privileged Man podcast. So welcome to the Privileged Man podcast. If you're tuning in for the first time, then one quick favour from me. Please subscribe to the channel you're listening on. And if you enjoy this conversation, please give us a 5-star rating. It takes seconds, but makes a huge difference to the guests we can attract and quality of production. Now, let's get into it. So Robin, thank you so much for being on the Privileged Man podcast. I really appreciate you being here.
You're very welcome.
Well, let's dive straight into it. What happens to men's friendships when they enter their 40s and 50s?
I think actually, I'm not really sure that men's friendships change necessarily dramatically. It's very often more a case of circumstances changing. I mean, what's weird in a way, I don't think it's really weird, but if you like, what's characteristic of men's friendships is that they are somewhat casual. So they are a bit here today and gone tomorrow. So you can have, 2 guys who are very, very good friends from the age of, 8. They've tracked each other all the way through school, kept going all the way, and then suddenly they just drop out because one moves away. One decides to go off to Thailand for the rest of his life. And it really is a case of out of sight, out of mind. It's very different from the way the girls work. The girls, equivalent situation happens in girls. They're desperately trying to keep contact on the phone, on text, on Facebook, whatever. Guys, it's very much out of sight, out of mind. I don't know how many wives have told me, the hubby's off to some far-flung part of the country. And, before they go, so isn't that where your friend from school, Jimmy, lives these days? Why didn't you look him up? And they say the response they get is a kind of, and they know jolly well nothing's going to happen. If it was girls, they would be on the phone and say, I'm coming your way. So there's something weird in that sense about the way kind of men's friendships generally work. When they get sort of accidentally separated, can result in just, it's not a breakup, it's just a sort of decay and a loss. And so you can end up very easily with a situation where somebody can, because of what they're doing, and the obvious case is, people who are working, 24/7 at building a business or, some particular aspect of work that they're really engaged with that consumes all their time, and they just end up not investing in their friends. And the problem with all friendships of both men and women is that if you don't invest in them, they decay. And eventually they decay into kind of, somebody I once knew, but I haven't seen for years and years, and I don't really know much about them. So I think that's the main problem. And, actually, it often occurs to me that what the problem in a way with blokes generally, if you like, unlike the girls, is that their friendship groups are kind of made for them. That's generically true, of course, when we're children, because it's the, children of the family's friends, children in the street, children in your class when you go to primary school. As you go through, sort of high school and so on, it's the children that you interact with in your class, your year group, whatever. You go to university and you're in residences. There's a bunch of guys you go and do stuff with. And then sort of suddenly you get thrown out into the real world in a place where you know nobody. But I think men's friendships, because they're casual and they kind of depend on this artificiality of groups being put together for them, aren't really proactive in going out and finding new friends when they find themselves in a situation where they don't know anybody and or their friends have sort of vanished into history, as it were. So from that point of view, you then end up, usual thing that happens in people's lives is they get married, and in a sort of normal course of these kind of romantic relationships, the girls being very proactive manage the social life, and all the blokes' friends become the husbands of the wife's girlfriends.
Yeah.
And then, the big problem then is, as often, but as happens often enough, either you get widowed or you get divorced, and suddenly half your social network won't talk to you. In the one case, because they're kind of embarrassed to come round knocking on your door, after you've been widowed, to see if you're all right and how you're getting on, and in the other half because you're the villain, obviously.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the real danger point, I think, is because the blokes often end up then with their only network. They've not really kept up with their kind of childhood, teenagehood, young adulthood friends. They've disappeared. They no longer have close relationships with them. And all they've got left is their own side of the family. There's a mighty great hole, and they're left in a very bad place. In the modern world, I mean, in the traditional world, you would be living in a village, and the village would, they think you're a terrible person, but still they have to get on with you because you live there.
Yeah.
So in the village, you've got these kind of supporting mechanisms, and there were, but in the modern world where we live in semi-isolation, realistically speaking, we're a sort of, we live among strangers, you don't have those kind of supportive networks that we all once had when we were living in small communities.
Right. So amazing. Thank you for that. Great introduction. So the married men or men in relationships rely on their wives for their social life, and then the divorced or widowed ones then basically are excommunicated.
Yeah, it's a crash. Yeah,
and then so effectively, what we're saying is there isn't any response. Well, what I'm hearing is there isn't much responsibility on men, or men aren't taking responsibility for their friendships.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say it's that they're not taking responsibility. It's that they're socially lazy. I mean, I just think it's an intrinsic feature of the male social world. And it probably goes back to the fact that in small-scale traditional societies, men's friendships or friendship groups were created for them through the whole puberty ceremony process. You have a year group who goes through puberty together. They all, get taken out into the forest in the dark of the night and terrified to death by the adults sort of making, funny noises in the woods around them and jumping out at them and that kind of thing. These are, 13, 14-year-old kids maybe. But that terrifying experience bonds them for life. That group then remains the core. They become, and it's probably was necessary because that's how you make the warrior component of society, as it were. I mean, these guys have to be able to stand shoulder to shoulder no matter what happens and defend each other, when conflict occurs with neighbors. So they have to have this deep, deep bonding that comes essentially of being pushed into very scary experiences together. But that creates this bonded group that just runs through their entire lives in these small-scale societies. And I think for that reason, there's never been any evolutionary pressure on the males to develop the need to engage in the business of quote unquote, finding friends because they don't have to. They're there. What you are given basically is lifelong friends. Our problem is we start off like that. We're all in the same class at school together, and then we dispersed all over the place instead of being kept together. Girls are very different in that case. You look at all these traditional societies, it's the women that move on marriage from one community to their husband's community, and they're on their own. They have to find a close friend who can act as a kind of emotional and moral support for them within a group of who are all on the bloke's side. So I think you've had this long period of evolutionary pressure creating very different kinds of social styles in men and women. If you look at how the men's social world and the women's social world works, they are incredibly different. And we're kind of only just really beginning to realize that. And that's partly because, of course, most of us only have experience of one of those worlds. We grow up in an all-boys environment or an all-girls environment, even when you go to mixed-sex schools. And if you look at the adult world, it's incredibly gendered. 75% of women's social networks are women, and 75% of men's social networks are men. And that figure doesn't change from the age of 5 to the age of 85. So we're highly gendered socially. Partly that's because, guys have more in common with each other. They've got more to talk about to each other. Same with the girls. So there's a natural tendency. They have different interests. They tend to segregate. You can see this happening before your eyes in conversations. If you go to a reception or anything like that, where people are gathered together informally, and just watch what happens, is because there's very strict limit on the number of people who can be in a conversation together. At 4, you can't have more than 4 people in a conversation. Once it gets to 5 or 6 people, it will split. Conversation will split into 2, and it will start to split on gender lines. The girls will start talking to each other. The boys will start talking to each other. And, so anything up to 4, it'll be mixed sexes, as they say. Anything after 4, there's a very, very high likelihood conversations will become gender specific.
That's very interesting. It's probably why I don't enjoy dinners with more than 4 people, because I get so distracted wanting to be in every single conversation that's going on.
It is literally a cognitive limit, that we don't have the sort of brain power capacity to manage more than 3 other minds in a conversation.
Very interesting. Talking of numbers, you've got a rather famous number named after you. Did you name that, or did somebody else name it?
No, it was named on Facebook, apparently.
And for the listeners, it's Dunbar's number. If you haven't heard of it. So could you explain that a little bit? Well, actually, not a little bit, but go into it. That'd be great.
So Dunbar's number is the natural limit on the number of relationships, meaningful relationships, that you can have at any one time. And that's about 150. And that includes both family, extended family, and friends. And in the small scale traditional societies, that 150 would be entirely made up of extended family. But in the modern world, with our much reduced family sizes, you can include all your extended family, and then you end up with lots of spaces left over, if you like. And that's what we fill with friends. So in the kind of modern world, on typically about half your 150 will be extended family, half will be friends. That number is a constraint in our brain, as it were. We just can't handle more relationships than that. Obviously, some people can do a bit better and some people do slightly worse, but the average is always about 150. That came off the back of a prediction from an analysis of group sizes in monkeys and apes. And it turned out that there is a very strong relationship between the size of groups that a particular species of monkey or ape lived in and the size of its brain. And from that, if you plugged human brains into it, you get this prediction of about 150, which turns out then to occur all over the place. The interesting thing is that it's not actually a number, but a series of numbers. So It probably ought to be Dunbar's numbers, because what it is the structure of your social network looks a bit like the kind of ripples on a pond round where you throw a stone in. So if you imagine yourself as the stone being thrown into a nice clear lake, the ripples kind of represent these layers of friendship that you have running out from you, and the size of the ripple, or the circle created by the ripple, reflects the size of the circle, and the kind of height of the wave reflects the emotional closeness. So you have a very small number of very close relationships, and then outside that is a bigger layer with slightly less close relationships, and so on and so forth, till you get out to 150. What's interesting about these is the numbers have very, very specific fractal patterns. So the numbers occur at 5, 15, 50, 150, and then beyond the 150, they extend to 500, 1500, and the last layer possible is 5,000. Everybody beyond 5,000 is strangers. We've never seen it, don't even recognize their face.
Could you just explain those numbers as you go?
Well, you could put names to them that kind of make intuitive sense, as it were. So this inner layer of 5 is what you might think of as your best friends, as it were. Remember, they're 50-50 family and friends, at least up until you get to the 150. Beyond that, they'll all be friends and no family. But in the inner layers, it's roughly 50-50 family and friends. The innermost core at 5, which we sometimes refer to as the shoulders to cry on friends, because they're the ones who will drop everything to come and pick you up when your world falls apart, as it were, put you back on your feet. They're also known as the support clique for the same reason. But you can think of them as your best friends. They'll typically consist of 2 close family members, a parent, or maybe even a grandparent, and a sibling perhaps, or an offspring, plus a couple of friends. It has that kind of makeup. And then the layer outside, which adds another 10 people. So these layers are inclusive. Each layer includes the layers inside it. The next layer at 15, which has at its core the shoulders to cry on clique of 5, has another 10 people in it. That layer of 15 people has long been known about. It's called the sympathy group. It's the people whose death tomorrow you would be genuinely upset about. Not simply sorry to hear about it, but genuinely upset. They're the people that are really meaningful in your life. And you might think of those as your close friends, if you like, as opposed to your best friends. And then the layer up beyond that goes out to about 50 people. You might think of those as good friends. That layer tends to be the people you draw on mostly for your big social occasions. So you might think of the sort of 15 layer as the people who are your regular social partners. If you're looking for somebody to go to the theatre or just to go out and have a beer or something, that's where they'll come from, that 15 layer. The 50 layer is your kind of Saturday barbecue. Let's have a party, it's somebody's birthday. Let's have a party with a barbecue. If we ever get to have decent weather again in Britain, you'll draw on that core of 50 people, and obviously that will include their kids as well as the adults. Then the 150 is this rather loose group of people who you have. What defines these relationships in the 150, the Dunbar number, if you like, is that they're relationships that are reciprocal. You know who they are, they know who you are. The relationship has history. If they ask you to do a favor, you'd feel kind of morally obliged to say yes and not expect payment for it, or necessarily that they pay you back. Probably wouldn't lay your life down for somebody in the 150 circle. You'd lay your life down for somebody in the 5 circle. But you'd say, if somebody said, could you come around and give us a hand? You'd say, oh, sure, be around and we'll do it. Beyond the 150, relationships become much more transactional then. Yes, I'll come and help you clear your woodland, or harvest your field, but only providing you do the same for me next year. Right, it's strictly transactionally, economically reciprocal in that sense, rather than reciprocation of favors without expectation of return. So, and these numbers turn out to be, we've shown mathematically that these numbers are the product of the efficiency in the way networks work. There's something weird about these numbers, which allows information to flow very efficiently around the network. And in between, things don't work very well. So beware. Stick with 150. 100 isn't any good. Everything will fall apart. 200 isn't any good either. Everything will fall apart. You've got to sort of be as near as possible on the nail. Having said that, I mean, there's a certain amount of variation in these numbers. Introverts, they tend to have smaller numbers. Extroverts have larger numbers. But the layers largely are determined in real life, as it were, by how much time you devote to them. So we devote 40% of our total available social time and effort to the 5 people in that shoulders to cry on layer. Obviously, quite a few of them we actually either live with or we live very close to. So we see them very regularly. 40% of time is absorbed by just those 5 people. The next 10 people that make up the 15 layer, the sympathy group layer, get another 20%. So 60% of your total social time and your emotional effort, your emotional capital, if you like to think of it in this way, is given to just 15 people. And then beyond that, get less and less and less. So this kind of translates into about 20 to 30 minutes a day on average for each of the people in the shoulders to cry on layer, each of the 5 people there. And the people sort of in the outer edges of the network in the 150 layer, they probably only get about 20 seconds a day from you on average. So it takes quite a while to accumulate enough spare time to give them an evening. So they're the once a year people. I sometimes describe the 150 Dunbar's number there as your bar mitzvah, weddings and funerals circle. They will turn up.
Yeah.
You may not know, but believe me, they will turn up out of this sense of obligation to you.
So we're taking a short break to challenge a common misconception. People think privilege means having it all, but does it? Take the Privileged Man's scorecard and find out where you really stand. It's a quick, eye-opening look at your personal, professional, and emotional wealth. You might just be surprised. The link to the scorecard is in the description below. Now back to the conversation. Yeah, it's really fascinating. And just going a little bit further towards was there a number of 1,500, which is sort of almost like the capacity? Is that right?
Yes, this is. I mean, if you look at these in terms of the structure of small-scale traditional societies, the hunter-gatherer societies, you see these numbers very clearly. The 150 is what would be known as a clan. So it's a group of people who own some real estate, really, a hunting territory. They don't necessarily all live together, because these societies tend to live in smaller groups of 30 to 50, but families float around different camp groups of 30 to 50 within the same clan. You see the structure very nicely. What this 1,500 layer number lives, which is kind of the last meaningful number beyond that, actually turns out to be the size of tribes. And tribes are defined linguistically. They're all the people that speak the same language. And in small-scale societies, it's amazing how small these. We're used to, a language like English, which half the world speaks. We think, there is only one language, and the answer is no. There are even 6 different languages called English, recognized as being English, belonging to the English family. In some sense, similar to the Romance languages, which French, Spanish, Romanian, Italian, which all descend from Latin. They've been going a little bit longer than the various English families, but languages have this tendency to become to diversify, so that they become incomprehensible, except to the people in the village. It's remarkable how they do it. What it's clearly designed to do is to allow you to identify trustworthy people, right? Without think of life in small scale societies, very low density. You're wandering through the forest and somebody appears on the trail in front of you. If they belong, can you trust them? If they belong to your clan, you know them personally because that's within your 150, right? So you know who that is. Oh, it's Uncle Jim. Everything's hunky-dory. If you don't know who they are, there's a very good chance they're going to clobber you and rob you or kill you. So you better be sure very quickly that you can identify whether they are trustworthy or not. And that trustworthiness is about being a member of the same tribe. So we use lots of these kind of cultural cues to identify membership of the same tribe. And language is core, because the moment you speak, and it's uncheatable because you learn your language or your dialect very, very early on, as a child, obviously, and it doesn't really change very much. So you can identify, whether somebody's in your tribe or not, the moment they open their mouth. They can pretend to put on all the other things that we use, like tattoos and the clothing we wear and the hairstyles we have. All these things can be cheated. They're helpful. It helps to identify a possible member of the tribe at a distance. But if you really want to be sure, you listen to what they say. And we still do it. I mean, this is why we have dialects. Dialects are a reflection of that. And languages break up into dialects so quickly that you can identify a native English speaker, a British English speaker from the British Isles. So somebody who's born and grown up here, the moment they open their mouth, you can tell to within 25 miles where they were born, if you know the dialects of English, right? Now, you and I don't have to do that. All we have to know is the moment they open their mouth, is that my dialect from my village, or is that those wicked people from the next door village whom we never talk to and definitely don't marry?
Absolutely fascinating. It's absolutely fascinating. I'll just, name it. Like, being a privileged man, having been to boarding school, it is people open their mouths and you kind of just know. And coming back to what you were saying earlier about, you were thrown into, or the boys were thrown into the woods by the adults at 13, 14. Well, we weren't quite thrown into the woods, but we were thrown into somewhere without any parents.
Yes.
And so there is that sense of survival. People don't really talk about it as survival, but there's that knowing look, that knowing understanding of what you went through. And so therefore, I think this tribe element that you talk about is actually, it rings true to me.
It's very deep. I mean, that is why you have old school ties. Quite literally. You went to X school. I see. And that's an instant bond, even if you weren't there at the same time. It's the same thing. So, actually, what's interesting about these cues we use to create this sense of belonging to a tribe are actually the mechanisms we use to create friendships. So friendships are very driven by this effect called homophily, which means love of the same. So, we much prefer our friends to be similar to us. And the effect is massively, massively strong. So the layer a friend lies in reflects the number of dimensions that the two people share. Let me just explain first. This homophily effect comes in two kind of forms. One is, if you like, biological things we can't do much about. So things like our sex, our personality, our age, our ethnicity. And by ethnicity, I just don't mean race. I mean people from the north of England as opposed to the south, or from the next door village and the next door valley to you. It's very, very precise. And these cues are they're kind of like distance cues. I always kind of describe it in terms of courtship, as it were. When you go through the door into a room of people and your eyes meet with somebody across the room and you go, that, there is the love of my future love of my life. I recognize it instantly. It's those kind of distance cues which you use initially to decide, shall I go to the next stage and go up and say, hello, my name is Pete? Or do I bail out and go to the bar? And we're kind of doing much the same thing. So we use these distance cues, things that are kind of biological and therefore easy to see, to decide, well, shall I go to the next stage? The next stage involves engaging the person in conversation. And now we're into the other half of the homophily effect, which is what we call the 7 pillars of friendship. So these are like 7 dimensions, if you like, of friendship. They're kind of like a supermarket barcode, but instead of being stamped on your forehead, they come out of your mouth, essentially. And the 7 pillars are speaking the same language, or better still, dialect, having grown up in the same area. And particularly, I think it's probably the teenage years are important. It's where you learn how to be a member of a community, right? What's the way things are done in our community? Having the same, what I would now call, career trajectory. So, this is why lawyers have lawyers as friends, and doctors have doctors as friends, and journalists have journalists as friends, and CEOs have CEOs as friends. As I unkindly always say, once upon a time, we thought that the reason lawyers only had lawyers as friends is because nobody else would speak to them. But it's not true. It turns out, to be the same everywhere. Electricians have electricians friends, carpenters have carpenters friends. The point is they've got something in common.
Yeah.
And they have a common history. And that's where, which school did you go to, which university did you go to, which course did you do at which university, and so on, then become markers of having something in common with each other. Then beyond these, there are having the same hobbies and interests, having the same moral, political, religious views, in other words, how you see the world, how you expect people to behave, and the same sense of humor and the same musical tastes, oddly. But those two appear to be extremely strong effects.
Yeah.
If you come across somebody and they're a Led Zeppelin fan, boy, you've got a friend for life. Having thought about this a lot over the years, this is actually doing, what is it? It's identifying a very small cultural community, basically the one you grew up in. And this is why things like going to the same school, having grown up in or even been born, is the shortcut to that in the same village or town, then becomes an important basis for at least a temporary relationship, because you now have something in common. Oh, you came from what's it town, village. We might not have lived there at the same time, but we know the same streets. We know the old landlord, Jimmy the landlord, who was forever throwing us out for being a nuisance as kids, stuff like that. And the strange odd people in the town, and have a laugh about the kind of oddballs and all that kind of thing, and it creates a sense of belonging. So it's doing 2 things. One is it's creating this sense of belonging, sense of identity, and the other is it's giving you something to talk about, so that you can sit down and engage in a conversation that goes on all night and will continue tomorrow, next week, the week after, rather than being just a casual, sort of somebody interesting to talk to in the pub when there was nobody else there, for one evening.
We've grown up, I've grown up in this sort of world of diversity, inclusion, etc., which that's a commercial conversation, but it also bleeds across the personal relationships too. But what I'm hearing you say is actually the science backs that you don't really want diversity in your friendships. You just actually want someone who's very close to you.
Well, I think the problem here, shares a lot in common with you, because that allows you to spend time with them and to do lots of things like laughing and singing and eating together that kind of create the glue, which creates friendships, bonded friendships. If you can't have a conversation with somebody, there's no incentive to spend time with them. So the relationship doesn't build. So that's all these 7 pillars are really doing. They're purely cultural, the 7 pillars. You learn them. They change slightly during life, but you kind of never lose them completely. Your sense of humor that you enjoy, the jokes you enjoy might change. So the music you enjoy but somehow, the music of your teenage years has pristine position. It's pole position in the.
I'm not sure the mid 1990s were a classic time to be going through the teenage years of music.
That might well. I couldn't possibly comment. That might well be the kind of honest truth. But the reality is, if you bump into somebody and they were, followers, fans of the same band, that creates this sense of, however bad the band was, that creates this sense of camaraderie that allows you to build a relationship, at least on a temporary basis. But as I say, the number of those dimensions that you share then determines where you sit on the Dunbar circles. So if you can tick 6 or 7 of the 7 pillars, you'll be up in the inner shoulders to cry on circle of 5. If you only tick 1, you're for sure going to be down in the 150 circle. But then what we've done is extrapolate those to act as cues of tribal membership. And that's then where language comes in. Of course, language and dialect in particular is one of the 7 pillars, but that provides a particular core. And of course, you can see where all the others come in, because the tribe sort of moral and political and religious views are all the same. The tribe's sense of humor are the same. The music is the same. The lesson, in some sense, for the modern world where we're, sort of dispersed all over the planet in very large companies with, tens of thousands of employees, maybe, is how a company creates a sense of belonging in that tribal sense, that we are this is who we are and why we sign up. And you see that in the way the Japanese companies work, and I think was partly a tribute to their or the cause of their success way back in the 60s and 70s in the Japanese car industry in particular. They would describe themselves, I am a company man, and fill in company by the name. I am a Mitsubishi man. I am a Toyota man. You belong to the company in that sense, and it created a sense of commitment and willingness to work hard. Of course, cooperate with all the other people, because the success of a company, any endeavor, any kind of organization, depends on how well all the members do their job and coordinate with each other and cooperate with each other. If you've got a village that isn't talking to each other, that's why we kind of describe companies as a village, however big they are. You have to create this sense of a village where you belong, and have a commitment to the success of the collaborative enterprise is what it really amounts to. And if you don't have that, things will fall apart.
Well, it's very interesting. So my insights on that, having spoken to over, I guess, 1,000 men over the last couple of years who hold generally leadership positions, is that culturally they feel as though they're being ousted. They don't feel at home anymore. Yes. Even in leadership positions, they can say this, they can't say this, they can't, give someone a compliment. They just don't know where they stand, and so they find themselves isolated and lost, which can't be a great thing for the company. So my question is how does this all relate to the men in leadership?
It's tricky, because the problem is, at the end of the day, you have to have the leadership. I mean, what we've shown is that for organizations, you can have a completely democratic organization which requires no formal leadership, no formal management structure, that works perfectly well, but it's very, very small. It has to be small. There's a crisis point at somewhere around about 40, so just coming up to that 50 barrier. But we kind of pick it up at around about 40 in particular in organizational terms, where there's a phase transition from having no formal structure to having to have some kind of formal structure. You've got to have somebody in charge. This can be not just in businesses, but in informal things like clubs or associations, communities of practice, all the kind of thing where associations, for finance officers between different companies, they're going to go away and have a jolly for a weekend or something and talk to each other about interesting stuff like accounts or whatever.
That was my childhood with my father being an accountant, so I get it.
Right. So those kind of informal arrangements, never mind the formal arrangements of organizations and businesses, up to 40 is fine. It can be everybody chips in and helps out. But once it gets past 50, you just have to have some kind of management structure. You have to have in effect, a CEO with a committee that runs it, and otherwise meetings don't happen. Nobody remembers to get the tea in or the biscuits or little silly things like that, which just get in the way. Little frictions that prevent the thing working and cause people not to bother to come in the future. And the bigger it gets, unfortunately, inevitably, the more layers you have to have, probably. But which then tends to create this sort of distance between the top layer, if you like, the C-suite management, and worse still, the CEO right at the pinnacle of the whole pyramid, and the folks on the shop floor. And it's how to bridge that gap without it's a very tricky thing to bridge in terms of personal relationships, because there is no way, if you have, 40,000 people in your company, the CEO can wander onto the shop floor and go, "Jim, how are you doing? Haven't seen you for ages, come and have a beer." It just wouldn't happen, not least because he wouldn't know Jim from anybody else, and he wouldn't know the details. Although I sometimes think that CEOs have the kind of, an effective CEO often has not quite the gift of the gab, but it's rather like a kind of medium, a spiritualist medium, very good at feeding lines to people, which people then pick up and think, "Oh, he knows all about me," and gives them the information back without thinking. So that, like a spiritualist medium, I hear a voice, is it a male voice? And you go, yes, it is. Is that kind of response. So they're very good at, in that sort of subtle way, at engaging with people and making them feel that they really know who they are. Perhaps they can just remember one or two things about them, or they can pick up clues in that kind of way. But it's a very dangerous thing, because you can easily just get it very badly wrong, and it requires a particular kind of skill, and not all people who end up as CEOs will have those kind of social skills, as it were, necessarily. It's not a criterion for a good CEO as opposed to a bad CEO, if you see what I mean. There are other criteria that are much more important in terms of the management side. But somehow you need to be able to create this sense of belonging. Now, there's kind of been some really interesting work done by Alec Jeffreys on what distinguishes what he calls centennial companies from non-centennial companies. So centennial companies, organizations, are organizations that have been around for over a century. So what prompted him to get interested was the observation, which a number of people had been commenting on, that lifetimes of big companies these days are getting shorter and shorter. Right? Yeah. If you look at the kind of life, the duration, the lifetime of the equivalent of FTSE, let's say 250 or Dow Jones listed companies back in the 1920s, 1930s, it was something like 70 years. It's down to 10 now. the turnover is phenomenal. Companies come and go. There's a few that survive, and these are centennial companies. So what's the difference between the centennial companies and the non-centennial companies? And his conclusion, having looked at a lot of them and interviewed a lot of the people involved, is a number of key things. One is they're very small. They typically have a core employment of only about 500 people. The rest, they may be quite big, but there are a lot of sort of temporary workers, casuals that come in and go out, as it were, because of it. But the core is only about 500 people. They have CEOs who are in place for a decade at least, rather than football management style in and out revolving doors.
Yeah.
And they overlap with the next CEO, right? So there's a period of passing on the knowledge, as it were, from the outgoing CEO to the incoming CEO. There's a sense of being a family. Everybody's part of the family. That's all about the culture you create. There's a sense in which the organization exists to do a public good. It's not just there to make money for shareholders. It performs a good which the folks out there want. Doesn't matter whether it's a piece of kit, a nice microphone like you have there that you can sell to people, these strange people that need microphones in their lives.
Aren't they strange?
It might be, designing road layouts or making sure the electricity runs into houses, whatever it is, whether it's a government organization, a hospital, a manufacturing organization, insurance company, you name it, it has to have this sense that it is doing something which is beneficial to the wider society. And those are the key things that seem to distinguish these long-lasting companies that have capacity to survive the ups and downs. I mean, there will be other things like, management flexibility and the ability to cope with changing environments and changing demands. If you're making products, and as products go out of fashion, you need to have something new coming in to replace them and so on. Those will all also be true. But there's something about the culture of the society that's important. And I kind of go back to, how these things were done, or the question you're about to ask is, well, how do you do that? How do you organize that kind of culture in a business and organization to enable that to happen? Because it's not just about the CEOs being there for a long time. It's about the sort of culture that goes right down to the shop floor that everybody's part of. And I always go back to how this was done by the founding fathers of many of the big multinationals that are still with us. If you think of the Cadburys and the Leverhumes and the Mars family and all these big companies, one thing that was characteristic of them is they all had social clubs. They all recognized. So most of these companies were founded in the late 19th century, 1870s onwards. But right the way through until the Second World War, one of the key things they did was they put a social club on the factory site. And, that was an era when everybody liked playing tennis rather than watching it on telly. They did it. And so they all had tennis clubs, or they had bowls clubs, or whatever it may be. So it was a place for the employees to gather after work, to get to know each other. For you from the shop floor or sales or some other department to get to meet the people in accounts and discover they're really quite human. And you have a lot in common with them, and this changes the whole nature of the relationships you then have within other people within the organization. And that was all done for free. There were no subscriptions. I mean, the very famous ones were the railway institutes all over the empire, everywhere where we built railways, and we built most of the railways, except in North America. But most of the rest of the world, we built the railways. But every station had a railway club that the members belonged to. And, they were very famous. And, they were social things. There were dances, there were tombolas and all these kind of things that people liked in those days. Or there were, little concerts put on, or They'd have some talks, philosophical societies of some kind associated with it, where people could go and listen to a speaker and discuss matters of importance to the day. It all created, as well as somewhere to go and have a beer and something to eat, maybe. It's creating this social environment where people can engage with each other. And create this sense of belonging rather than that you're there on sufferance,
Yeah, it's absolutely fascinating to me. So I'm taking that into the modern day now, that CEOs let's face it, don't have a great reputation in wider society. There's a disconnection. They get paid so much money, etc.,
Yes.
etc. And what happened in the American elections just now, I've heard a lot of thought leaders repeat many times that what Trump did over Kamala Harris was to get on podcasts and to get known and to actually
Yes.
speak in detail about who and what he was. You may agree or disagree, not the point. The point is
Yep.
that people got to know him on a deeper level rather than just the sound bites.
Yep.
And apparently now there is all sorts of scrabbling going on to get CEOs on podcasts, to get not just the external clients, et cetera, knowing them, but the internal staff to get them to know them better. So, yeah, I've just had the ex-chairman of PwC on, for example. I also have headmasters of schools on, because they're now seeing it as the sort of chance for them, the parents and the pupils, to get to know them. It's very interesting.
That's very interesting. But B, it makes an inordinate amount of sense. And I can see exactly why it should work. Because there is a sense, I mean, we've been trying to get away from the idea of the CEO as God stuck up on the top floor, as it were, and dictatorially telling us humble workers on the shop floor, how to run our lives. But there is a sense in which you run the risk of throwing the baby out with the bathwater if you get rid of that kind of sense, in that there is an element of charisma that has to be there about CEOs. I think if you look at the really successful CEOs, we won't name too many of these companies, though I happen to be working on here on the laptop made by one of them. Where
they're fruit by any chance?
Where there is a sense in which you have to have a degree of charisma that attracts people to come and work for you, whether they're the clever guys that do all the software or invent the machinery or invent the products, or just the humbler folk that sweep the floor and make the sandwiches. That they all feel they want to come and sit at the feet of the guru. And that it's not the only way to do it. I don't think. I think there's there is no silver bullet of how these things have to be done, because it depends a lot on the local culture and the kind of organization, the way the organization is structured, all sorts of other things. But certainly one way is this charismatic way, because we're very susceptible to it. Extremely attracted by charismatic individuals, and this is why you get these effects. We kind of, they become larger than life, which is why everybody used to be shocked at how small Queen Elizabeth II actually was when they finally got to meet her, because they assumed she must be very tall if she's the Queen. And you didn't often see, famously, of course, it's disproportionately the taller of two candidates in American presidential elections gets elected. I mean, it really is true. Since the days when they've appeared on podia together, and sort of in the days when they wandered around on ox carts and tried to shout over some rowdy villagers on their own, it's different. But once you see them together, it's very difficult. And that's why certainly in the sort of 70s and 80s and 90s, the Americans would have microphones raised up or lowered, and only one microphone. And so they would lower it so it was always at the same height. irrespective of the which candidate was coming forward to speak. So she didn't get this sense, oh my goodness, he's really tall, towering above the microphone.
That's a good tip for me as well. I mean, I think tomorrow I'm doing a podcast with everyone who's almost a foot taller than me. But it's interesting you say that, because I also heard the world's most evil dictators have all been under 5'8".
Oh, yes. Now, this is the problem. This is the Napoleon complex problem. Right?
Yeah.
Because there is, I mean, it's very clear. I mean, this is everyday life experience, as it were. I mean, tall people sail through life, apparently with great ease. And it's partly because the rest of us kind of bow down before them. Literally, and we've shown, for example, ironically, using the experience of Poland after the First World War, because the Second World War, I mean, they lost huge numbers of men one way and another in Poland. Basically got hammered from both sides, of course. And after the war, there were an awful lot of women and very few men. And so, the men were in nirvana because they were, women were desperate for anybody. But you can see, as the decades went on through the 50s and 60s and 70s and 80s, and the population reconstituted itself, taller men started to get preferential marriage frequencies. They were being, and there's something about tallness in men, not in women, but in men. Often it's the reverse in women, but tallness that has this sense of charisma. So then you've got people who, are on the short side, as it were, Napoleon, Hitler, all sorts of other ones you can think of, who basically have to fight like crazy. They can't just swan through life and life bows down before them. So they right from the start, they get to the top essentially by fighting. So it's not surprising they end up where they are.
Yeah, I can't say that I'm on the same track towards Napoleon and Hitler, but I certainly understand their pain.
It's not worth it. Look what happened to them.
Well, true. That's too true.
And that was despite the fact that Napoleon genuinely was a military genius.
Right.
Right. It was only because he was in bad shape that he lost the Battle of Waterloo.
That sounds as though it's another podcast in itself. Just coming on to
the lessons of history.
The lessons, well, they are there, aren't they? Aren't we seeing that at the moment? Final question for you. Thank you for giving us this time. The social brain hypothesis and its importance. Can you explain it and the importance of it?
The social brain hypothesis is very simple. It's simply that the size and complexity of a species social group is determined by the size of, technically it's a particular part of the brain, but that part of the brain is so large that it basically makes up most of it. So very often it's just easier to say the whole of the brain. The size of your brain determines the number of relationships you can manage. And I think we underestimate how difficult it actually is to manage this social world. It is absolutely extraordinary how, because everybody's wanting different things, but somehow we're able to get it to work. And it's intuitive, but it depends on the skills that are, there in your brain. And that it turns out to apply right the way across, certainly the birds and mammals as a whole, particularly so the primates. Primates, the monkeys and apes, they're the ones that live in the biggest and most complex forms of society of any species of animal. But you can see it in reduced forms. The simplest form that you get in a lot of birds and kind of less socially advanced mammals is just the difference between species that have monogamous pair-bonded arrangements as opposed to promiscuous herd living species. The pair-bonded relationships species have much bigger brains than the species that are promiscuous and live in herds. And it's because It's hard work and requires a lot of careful thinking at an unconscious level, I suppose, to manage relationships where two individuals, or in the case of primates, many individuals, are effectively living together in the same space. The forces that drive individuals apart are so strong otherwise that you have to have these kind of very advanced cognitive capacities to hold the group back together again.
Amazing. Wow. I certainly feel full of wisdom. Thank you so much. I really appreciate your time, and it's been an absolute privilege having you.
Oh, great pleasure to talk to you, and a privilege.
Thanks, Robin.
Very good.
So thank you for listening to the Privileged Man podcast. If you've built the career, the family, the lifestyle, but feel something's still missing, have a look at the private network for male leaders I founded called Monumental. If you're ready to grow with like-minded men, check out the links in the description.